Warning: the following podcast features views and opinions that are likely to trigger the extreme fanboys and fangirls who disagree with them. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome, everybody, to Hot Takes with Billy Biz, brought to you by Season 2 of Reboot It, streaming exclusively on YouTube because you have to see it to believe it. And believe it or not, I have one of my Reboot It co-hosts. We used to do the commute killers together until Corona killed commutes better than we did. Mr. Ed GREER is joining me today. What's up, buddy?
Dude, what is up, man? I miss being able to be in a car with you.
It's been a long time. A lot of things are different, but you know, I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole, but I do feel like we get some of that fun in Reboot It now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a little bit of it, but you know, I kind of miss just the joshing around that would lead to some great talks, rather than it being so focused on us having to do the job of saving these crappy franchises.
Well, there's a lot of good ones coming up, including one that almost broke some friendships. I'm excited for you guys to follow along with all the drama. You can check that out. But today, we are talking about a movie. Now, if you followed the show, if you subscribe, I hope you do, you know that we did a very deep dive the last 2 weeks into Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. The last couple episodes, including those and talking about Tron Legacy, we've been talking a lot about how 2008 was really a pivotal year, specifically for comic book movies. There were kind of two forks in the road. There was the Iron Man way of doing them, from then on out, the Marvel way, and then there was the Dark Knight gritty approach. But then, towards the very end of 2008, one movie decided, screw that, I'm doing my own thing. Today, we're talking about Punisher Warzone. To this day, I kind of feel like there's no other comic book movie quite like this one.
Well, you know, I would definitely agree with that. It is, well, we're going to get into it deeply, but just in summary, I think it might be the only movie to capture how crazy the comics were at the time that it was coming out. You know what I mean?
Let's talk a little bit about the comic book character of the Punisher. I think it's safe to say, is it safe for me to say that you are a fan of the comic book Punisher?
It is safe to say that there are between 35 and 47 Punisher comics that are immaculate, perfect pieces of art and the best hero fiction that I've read for the vigilante style character.
Sure.
I mean, so much better than any other vigilante style character, so much better than any street level character. There's like 30 something to maybe 50 something just superb stories to me that kind of show that this character has infinite potential to be a really good vigilante character. But then of course he gets swept up with everybody's, you know, Death Wish and Dirty Harry and some of these characters that frankly are inferior to the best versions of the Punisher. He gets swept in with a bunch of these crazos, you know, because he's crazy, but he gets swept in with the other crazies too much.
I think that's kind of where, like, if we're going to start, the Punisher was never a comic that I was really into. In fact, for a long time, the only version of the Punisher that I knew was like the 2 episodes he was in the Spider-Man animated series, and he had a really lame like headband on, and he didn't have like real guns that shot bullets, because it was weird. In the Spider-Man animated show, they had like everything was like normal world except all guns were like Star Wars blasters. It was just an odd choice. I never really liked the Punisher, and to this day I still don't really like the Punisher, and I'll tell you why. I feel like the Punisher is the least interesting version of Batman that you can do. I feel like the difference between a Batman and a Punisher is that, you know, they're both characters that suffered this extreme loss in their personal lives. The difference being that Bruce was a boy when this happened, and he takes that opportunity to find out how he can better himself to become this vigilante. With Frank, I feel like there's not as much character development because he's already a badass killing machine before his family is ever dead. So he just goes and he just mows down people that really have, at a certain point, have nothing to do, no connection whatsoever to the personal tragedy that he suffered. And I guess I just don't connect with that character. You had me read some stuff before this episode because I told you I wasn't really into Punisher. And again, like, not to say that I didn't like those comics or that they weren't well done. I just, specifically the Punisher Born one, I think he's in Vietnam and you're kind of seeing Frank, in an army setting. And it's like, yeah, this guy he's good at killing. He likes to kill. That's what he does. That's all there is to him.
Well, I mean, but I don't know, man. To me, that's the juice, honestly. Because when you really look at most comic book characters, he likes to jump. He likes to, you know what I mean? This guy jumps. This guy runs. This guy flies. And this rich guy coming down for the mountain. I'm not trying to be super liberal about it. Sure. But this rich guy coming down from the mountain to beat up poor people. People have beaten that plane into the ground. Me personally, I bought into that line of thinking about Batman, about him just coming from the hills to beat up poor people, until I realized that the best versions of Batman aren't fighting something that could be solved with economic programs. You know what I mean? There's no economic program that's going to solve cyber ninjas or the undead founders of Gotham rising from the grave. You know what I mean? But the Punisher, honestly, a lot of what Punisher is fighting could be solved with some social programs.
I mean, we'll get it to it. Put a pin in that thought because it definitely comes back in a very grandiose way in this movie.
Oh, heck yeah.
So my love of Punisher was not there. I don't want to. I think that, but you've always liked the street level comic book stuff more than I have. I think, anytime that we end up talking comic books, it's well established that I kind of like more comic-y comic books, and you tend to dig a lot of like the street level stuff, which is probably why I never really got into the Marvel Netflix stuff. It just wasn't for me. But let's fast forward a little bit. Mm-hmm. Let's go to 2004. Now, this episode is not about the Thomas Jane Punisher movie, but I want to talk about the Thomas Jane Punisher movie because I actually really like that movie for one reason. I think it's a very interesting movie. If I was a Punisher fan, it's probably a terrible Punisher movie because he doesn't do a lot of punishing, but that's probably why I like it. Because that version of the Punisher uses brains, I feel like, a lot more than any other comic book movie of Punisher I've seen. I still think one of the best scenes of that movie is where he's interrogating the guy and he tells him he's going to use a blowtorch on him, and he ends up like torching a piece of steak and putting a popsicle in his back, and he's like, it's so hot it's going to feel cold. He uses like the idea of the Punisher to scare people rather than this movie, which is just like, nope, he would literally just flay someone's brains. But that's kind of why I liked that version of it.
Well, but what's really funny is we have just opposite hot takes, because obviously maybe I am just a bookmark. And what I mean by that is, obviously everybody says the book is always better. And obviously the reason why the book is always better is because you can get into the inner monologue, and a lot of the times in comic book format, what you're putting between the panels is doper than anything anybody could have drawn or written.
Sure.
So I think that's probably why when I see Punisher, and not to get too far ahead, but the Punisher in this movie jumps on a chandelier. It spins around, shooting a bunch of dudes who just sort of come into the room to get shot, I guess. And there's just a lot of things like that. And parkour guys that, you know me, I'm a big parkour mark. As a fat, sedentary person, there ain't a damn thing more interesting to me than parkour. Okay? And they managed to kind of ruin that for me in this damn movie. I'm like, dude, what is going on? So, like, the fact that we're talking the Punisher, and I love the comic book version so much and so fervently, and you, frankly, really don't like them.
Right.
And then you rave about this movie, which I'm just like, he blew up the guy when he was doing a flip? What?
So, yeah, it's very strange that I dislike The Punisher so much and absolutely adore this movie. So when I watched it again this time, I was like, all right, what is it about it? And I think for me, I think I laid it out. I think the character of the Punisher for me is such a 13-year-old boy's fantasy. It's such like a like a like a Columbine rage type of thing that I almost find, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully because I understand a lot of people find things in it that I just don't, and that's not to, and I'm not trying to say that that's like a reflection of the people who like it, yourself included. I think for me, it just plays as like this really, like the character plays as this really weird, like violent fantasy escapism that I'm not really into. So with this movie, which is just so over the top violent, I think the fact that you see the Punisher for what it actually is, it's, you know, look, I don't know Lexi Alexander. We follow each other on Twitter, but I never spoken to her about this movie, probably never will. I don't know what her intent is, but I kind of feel like watching it, she was like, okay, you guys like violent Punisher things, I'll show you what that actually looks like. And it's so over the top ridiculous that it plays to me almost like Adam West Batman, where I enjoy it for just a purely comedic, like the Punisher is ridiculous type of level, where other people that do like this movie enjoy like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be. I don't feel like they sense any sort of irony in it whatsoever.
Well, okay. This is my thing. I think, again, Punisher more than most is the character that you imagine in your head. And also, I would like to say two things. Number one, Batman fights a bunch of villains that have nothing to do with his personal misfortune. I mean, that's his whole career. I mean, in most continuity, he doesn't even get to give any sort of justice to Joe Chill.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And the thing about the Punisher is, like, he's got two superpowers that the average person, if you would really think about yourself, if you had to kill 8 guys, no matter how well armed you were, you could probably lose that. You know what I'm saying? You could find some way to lose that, especially when it's all on the line and they're actually hardened criminals, you know?
Right.
So I think about it that way. But also, I think about it as he's got two superpowers. One, he's using military, like really high-level military tactics against basically street thugs and mafioso. And more like mafioso and street thugs in that order. And then when Garth Ennis takes over the book and other people start writing it, it's more like bankers and people who loot the treasury fund and go to an island. They wake up with a bomb in their bed too. You know what I'm saying? He starts to branch out and do cool stuff. And I'm just thinking, it's his two superpowers are, I'm using military super duperness versus people who really don't know how to fight like this, or they think they can, but they don't understand military precision. I'm going to do military operations on these guys. One guy doing that with like actual tactics. That's what I imagine. And I think that's really interesting that somebody could do that. And also, last things last, his other superpower is he always gets the right guy. Even in those dumbass Punisher stories, he really does do the research to make sure this person that's dying deserves it. He doesn't do too much. In some inferior versions of it, he's like doing what Batman does. The inferior Batman and the inferior Punisher have them jumping off of rooftops and landing on random criminals they just happen upon. That's stupid. Both of them are way better when they do an actual mission. So yeah, Punisher always does a mission. He gets as much detective work as Batman actually in the best Punisher stories to make sure that all this carnage that he's wreaking is proper. So those are his two superpowers.
What I meant by like, obviously, the ventriloquist had nothing to do with with Thomas and Martha Wayne's murder, but Batman's Rogues Gallery is, and look, I'll fully admit, maybe Batman isn't the most fair comparison. It just so happens to be like they share a similar baseline, but it was more along the lines of like his villains challenge Batman's psychology. There are usually some fraction of Bruce's psyche kind of brought to life.
Yes.
With the Punisher, it just seems like checking people off of a list, which to me is a little monotonous. However, since we're talking specifically about this movie, you brought up something which I kind of find fascinating. It's the one aspect of the Punisher that really, I think, would interest me, and this movie goes for it, which is, you said he does his research and he knows who he's going after. And the crux of this movie is that he screws up. He shoots someone that he shouldn't have killed because he just kills so indiscriminately. And I think that's like the first interesting thing that anyone's done with the Punisher in film. Even though I like the Thomas Jane one, that one is it's still just a revenge flick. And this one is not a revenge flick. This is like, oops, Punisher screwed up because Punisher punishes everyone without thinking.
No, I give it up to that, actually. I mean, just as I understand that, like, there's some Punisher fan out there that's going, no, fight that too. Tell him about how the Punisher's great and he doesn't make a mistake. I agree with what you just said, bro. Straight up. That's some walk across the olive branch stuff right there. Because I do agree with that. I honestly wish it had have happened in a comic because it would be better, but it does make a new narrative thrust in this movie. Him trying to make up for something rather than just this, in your words, monotonous. I would say relentless quest to punish.
Yeah, I think if anything, if I had any criticism of the film, and I think it's just like that thread could have been even hit a little bit harder, because I feel like this movie, it's very strange. This movie is balancing two different tones. I think you have the stuff with Frank is very introspective, and I think it's a great deconstruction of the Punisher because, you know, he punishes so, like I said, indiscriminately and so violently that to make a mistake is an interesting story for him. On the flip side of that, Dominic West is just so, he's having the time of his life chewing the scenery as Jigsaw, and it starts kind of dark. Like, it kind of starts like, you know what, this movie, the more that I think about it, it actually has a lot in common with Tim Burton's 1989 Batman, like down to the surgery scene where he gets his face reconstructed. But Jigsaw becomes this like beyond like maniacal. He's in a borderline a different movie than everyone else, but it's an equally interesting movie.
Oh no, I think for me, Dominic West was the fun part of that movie, honestly, because again, some of the chandelier shooting and the whole that's why I wanted you to read some of those comics, and I do understand that it's like 90s comics or even late 80s comics sometimes. And obviously, you know, they say comedy doesn't date well, but I don't think superhero stuff dates well either. I can't read no 1960s story and have it be as... Well, some of them are better because there's more story there. You know, they're not so decompressed. But some of it's worse because of, obviously, you know, the limitations of idiom and, you know, all this.
It's really tough to, like, get into this really great, like, you know, Batman stories, but someone's like, Gadzooks! And you're like...
Exactly. So, but I will say, like, I had you read a Punisher story, my favorite Punisher story, my favorite single issue, which is where the Punisher I envision in my head, and on the page in this issue, he shoots some guys, he goes through their loot, they have a videotape, he watches a tape, there happens to be some very horrible porn on there, let's just leave it at that, and so he goes to where that stuff is being produced, and it happens to be a military school, and he infiltrates, and he asks them about their whole program, he sees the grounds, comes back later that night as the Punisher to break it all up and shoot these guys, and gets beat up by like the Muay Thai instructor at this school that's doing this illicit stuff. Just gets beat up. And just the machinations he has to go through to defeat that guy. And after he defeats that guy, he spends 4 minutes trying to find his gun in the dark. And then he goes and completes the mission. Like, that guy's brave, man. Because if you can get beat up by a guy and have to find your gun to go do your job, you're very brave to be doing all that stuff at all. And I just, stuff like that got me about the Punisher. And then later comics written by Garth Ennis, it seems like he's just this malevolent force. Punisher Warzone meets that malevolent force quotient, certainly. Punisher is not playing with you. Punisher can do anything. Punisher's like, he's more like Deadpool than a guy in this movie. I mean, he's just ruining guys.
Maybe that's why it just like, so that first scene, my God, if I'm having a really bad day, I can just go on YouTube and just watch that first scene. They do the really heroic shot of him with, holding like the torchlight. And you're like, ooh, that's like a classic, iconic comic book type shot. Mm-hmm. And then completely undermine it by the just nonchalant of walking up and just slicing someone's head off, because why not? And that's when like, oh, this movie like it's not even like, it's gory, but it's not like Saw or like Hostel. It's not like torture porn gore. It's like ridiculous, like the chair through the eye or punching someone's face all the way in. Like, it's just, I don't know. I guess to me, it's just such a meta comment on how ridiculous I think the Punisher is, that I don't know if that was the intent, because it could play also, like I said, as someone being like, yeah, those comics are so violent that it's awesome to see a movie version be as violent. Whereas to me, I see it as like, yeah, those comic books are so violent that when you see it in real life, it looks so stupid, because that level of violence is ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I think of it as looking at, obviously, there are parts of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that I think are just pretty banal, frankly. But boy, that orgy of violence at the end, not necessarily the flamethrower stuff, and I hate to root for Brad Pitt smashing that lady's face all around, but that's the Punisher right there, dude. What, you got a gun on him, but he's still totally in control of the whole situation. And he, again, think about how interesting this is to me as somebody who I feel is a regular human and has a lot of weaknesses for a regular human. And just this guy who's just like, no, I'm in control of all these situations. I can whoop your ass, and let me show you. And then Punisher would also get injured and still be whooping people's ass. And that was a big deal to me, like being a tank. And not Wolverine. You're not just going to magically heal up. You're not going to go have your butler sew you up while you do isometric exercises in your memory palace. And this Punisher
literally like readjusts his broken nose. Like,
right?
The movie stops just to show you how tough this guy is.
And that's, yeah. And see, and stuff like that. I just imagine like his abilities, and I will call them that, being shown in a more naturalistic light would actually be very much more horrifying. You know what I mean? Like when you see like what somebody could really do to somebody, what the average military person, frankly, can do to the average fat citizen is ruinous. They could ruin you, dude. You know what I mean? And just like a guy like that, that's even better than most guys. And is like, I don't know, man, the overall holy mission to mete out justice and the fact that he's never going to be satisfied, to me, it's much akin to like Memento. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I think Ray Stevenson was actually, I didn't know who he was before this movie, but I think he was a great choice for a Punisher.
He was the best on-screen Punisher so far. Thomas Jane did a short film of him as the Punisher doing more street level. And I'm talking about he goes to a laundromat and beats up a guy, I think. Type of stuff. That's a great Punisher depiction, actually. It was pretty good for what it was. A little short fan film made by Thomas Jane. But and I also think that this new Frank Grillo looking guy, what's his name? John Barenthal.
John Barenthal, yeah.
John Barenthal is obviously the best looking Punisher. But he hasn't gotten and I guess isn't going to get the material to make the Punisher character dope. For my money, even though I really don't like this movie that much, and I think I definitely follow Lexi Alexander. I know she does not follow me. But she's awesome and she's dope. This movie, I do think it's what you said. Like, I think she's making I can make a dope-ass combat movie, but I'm not about to take this super seriously because that'd be silly. I really do think it's the spirit this movie's made in.
I mean, I think that is 100% reflected with the villains, you know, Jigsaw and Looney Bin Jim, who, like I said, they start fairly innocuous, you know, like, you know, typical, you know, like mobstery type guy, you know, obviously not Jim because he's crazy from the get-go, but it's almost like once he breaks his brother out and he's eating a guy's kidney just like raw on the ground, I feel like they're just so doofy and goofy, but in a fun way. It's almost like it's almost a little bit like Two-Face and the Riddler and Batman Forever, but yes. I'm not. But here's the difference, and maybe it's just because I'm not a Punisher fan. I get that people were upset with Tommy Lee Jones doing a wildly weird character that was not Two-Face. I have no idea what Jigsaw is supposed to be, but I really like this just like crazy off the wall guy.
Well, yeah, and see, that's the thing. That's another thing about the Punisher. And this is more the comic book Punisher, because I don't believe that they had Jigsaw and the Punisher Max line. They might have, as they kept expanding what Max meant, like as in beyond what Garth Ennis wrote, I guess they might have started slipping in. They did start slipping in characters like the Kingpin and stuff like that, and comic booking up even the damn Max universe. The whole point of the Max universe was the Punisher, and that's one thing, and you know my screed about the Punisher. If the Punisher really existed, he'd be the most interesting story, period. He might be undermined by the fucking coronavirus for a couple weeks. But beyond that, he would be the most interesting story, period, because it would be a guy who is damn near 60 years old, who's shooting guys up every week and doesn't get caught. And the 2 times he did get caught and sent to maximum security prison, he beat up everybody's ass in prison and escaped. And he is at large, and your city could be experiencing this big, shooting, and when they really look into it, the guys he shot were all justified to be shot. That would be the most interesting thing in the fucking world, especially when there's not some guy swinging overhead with a spider web, you know?
Right.
But so all that to say, Jigsaw, while he was in the comic books, not the Max line, while he was in the comic books, Jigsaw was the closest thing to being the Punisher's Joker. And as you can see, that's the difference between Batman and Punisher. Is Batman gets the Clown Prince of Crime, and Punisher gets f***ing Jigsaw and Looney Bin Jim.
I mean, it definitely does feel, like I said, this has kind of a similar DNA a little bit to Tim Burton's Batman, and it does feel like they were trying to make Jigsaw. I just assumed when I saw this movie, knowing almost nothing about Punisher except that he punishes, was that Jigsaw was kind of like his big bad, and that's how they kind of treat it. But it's also, I don't know, I almost like it's hard to criticize this movie because any other movie I'd be knocking it down, but I'm like, it almost doesn't matter. Like, that's almost besides the point, is that it's just like he's the most interesting obstacle Frank had in this particular week in his life, you know?
Well, he's one of the only people that kept surviving. Like Punisher, as you can tell by the fact that he's a vigilante murderer, he didn't really have too many recurring nemeses, you know what I mean? Right. So the fact that Jigsaw was still alive after many adventures, you're just like, damn, Frank, what's up? Jigsaw must be pretty tight. But much like Joker versus Batman, it really isn't that he's all that tight. It's like he just survives. He's so wacky that he survives the cunning precision of the Punisher that has murdered literally hundreds of people. Jigsaw somehow worms his way around it the way that Joker worms his way around Batman's so superior intelligence and so superior resources. He just sort of worms his way around it. It's weird.
So while we're talking Batman comparisons, let's talk about Punisher's Robin, Microchip.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
This is the one that I'm just like, I, more than anything, would love to see how you two guys met, because how does the Punisher hook up with Newman from Seinfeld? Like, what do you guys have in common? The microchip character is just very strange, because it's like, I could get it if he was like an old military buddy or something, but he just looks like a weird Craigslist guy. He looks like Jeebs from Men in Black.
Well, dude, you know what though? I think Microchip back in the 90s, I think Microchip might have been a master stroke. Because again, look at the people, and I'm not trying to be a jerk, but there's two groups of people who root for the Punisher, and I can put myself firmly in one camp.
Okay.
Fat, doughy people who can't fight, and people who can really fight and really want to shoot people and stuff, like cops and soldiers.
Right.
Those are like the distinct two camps. And yes, there is a distinct 13 to 17-year-old demographic who might not even go in either one of those piles, but universally they have been bullied. Right. You know what I'm saying? So those are the three groups of people who are really, really into the Punisher. And so I just think that the Punisher overall, he is a manifestation of certain people's wishes, and Microchip was the guy in the chair. Microchip was, you said it best, he's the Punisher's Robin, but look at what the Punisher's Robin is. A fat, ineffectual dude, but has the exact specific skills to make sure Frank is always right. Who's doing all this damn surveillance in the 90s comic books? Who's, you know what I'm saying? Who's doing all this stuff to help Punisher gather all this intel so that he can go in and execute these fools? There's 50 guys in there. Okay, me and Micro will devise a plan for me to personally destroy 50 guys in single combat. You know what I'm saying? By blowing up this and doing that and doing this, you know?
He's more like Barbara Gordon's Oracle than he is Robin.
Well, yeah,
because he doesn't really get in the, and I guess that's the thing. It's like, I understand there's probably a deeper reason, like in the comics, and Microchip probably has like a better relationship, you know, with Frank than there's time to really flesh out in this movie. But in this movie, he literally exists to just give Frank guns, and then to kind of have Punisher have this ethical dilemma at the end of the movie, but you're also just like, who is this guy? I don't care.
In all screen versions, it's just crap how he's introduced to Frank, how he decides to be in that TV show. Ugh, I'm sorry, yuck.
I've full disclosure, I've never seen the Punisher Netflix show.
In the Punisher Netflix show, long story boring, the reason why it's not the Punisher, and I'm not going to be long-winded with this, I promise. He is proactive, not reactive. In the show, it seems like he's quite reactive. And I don't like that. Punisher's proactive. Punisher doesn't just walk around and hope that crime happens around him. Punisher doesn't skulk on a rooftop and listen for assaults. He goes after targets and destroys them. Period. And in that show, there's almost none of that until he's like pushed and pushed and pushed, like he's some kind of reluctant Shane character. No. The Punisher is ready to get it on at all times. There is nothing holding him back now. No family, no nothing. And the only people he attracts are people with strange vendettas and mental problems who want to give themselves over to the singular force of quote-unquote justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what, they did a really good job of this in the Thomas Jane one, where he's kind of he's on a singular mission in that movie, where it's like, once he gets his revenge, he was planning on killing himself. You know, the end of the movie is him like, maybe I should hang on one bit longer. But I think that's the difference between a Batman and a Frank. You're right. It's like, there's that great scene in Batman Returns where the bat signal shoots up and Batman's just sitting there waiting for it. Like, Punisher would never sit there waiting for a Punisher signal. He is out there with his stupid white boots.
Well, and that's another thing. You're poisoned. Everybody, honestly, well, again, I liked Punisher in the white boot era, but obviously as I aged, that didn't age very well, and I did not like that. But then along comes Garth Ennis to just make it like everything I ever imagined, Billy. Just all the violence, none of the superheroes. I could go longer-winded on that, but that's exactly the appeal of the Punisher Max line, and that's why I love those comics so much. It's all the carnage, but with precision and smarts and different targets, not just a crackhead down the street. He stopped shooting people like that in the Garth Ennis ones, really. He stopped shooting like disadvantaged bums and stuff. He started shooting larger targets and meaner people who are doing worse things to the world.
I want to touch on that because this is where I think that the movie actually like very much calls out that kind of mentality of of a Batman or a Punisher, to the point where like this scene alone makes me think that the whole movie is kind of a commentary on the character itself. But it's the most ridiculous scene in this movie that I absolutely love, where Jim and Jigsaw, with this Patton-esque like American flag in the background, are going to these disenfranchised minority groups. They're going to the African American group. They're going to the Asian group. And they're basically saying like, hey, Punisher's picking on you guys. I think it's time that we hit back at him.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, it's definitely, I think, it blatantly calls out the facts that these vigilantes, if it didn't, like if blowing up one of those African-American parkour guys with a rocket launcher wasn't enough of a statement, here you have it just in the flesh, where it's just your villain is basically telling these rival gangs like, hey, this guy beats up on minorities. You realize you could probably take him. It's like 30-1,
Yeah, it's almost it's funny that's like an inverse of that speech in The Warriors, like, we've got the street suckers, can you dig it? That's he's doing that. Jigsaw's doing the can you dig it speech.
Which leads to, and that's where it's like this movie then turns into kind of a precursor to The Raid. The last 20 minutes of the movie are this like ridiculously over the top shootout in this hotel, which I don't by this point I've kind of lost track of the story, because it's like the police are kind of after them, but they're kind of after Frank. It's like, it doesn't really matter. The story in this movie does not matter.
Well, yeah, that dude that shows up in damn those Mila Jovovich movies with the zombies.
Right. Resident Evil.
Yeah. That guy, that black guy, that black British guy.
Right.
I love that guy. He was on, I think, Extras, that Ricky Gervais show where he played like an extra that kept rising the ranks or something. And He ended up being like an apprentice to that guy, or hanging out with that guy or something like that. Anyway, that guy's hilarious, but the fact that he's all up and through the Punisher, it's crazy to me.
It's just it's such a funny like statement. It's something that like I joke about all the time when I talk about Batman Forever. The beginning of the third act is Batman kind of putting on his brand new suit, and he's flying towards Edward Nygma, the Riddler's island. And there's a scene where Commissioner Gordon's just on the roof and he's shining the bat signal. He's just like, I guess he's not coming. I guess the Riddler just won. Like, just pointing out how ineffectual the police are in some of these superhero movies, like literally by choice. They just choose not to act because there's a superhero. And I feel like Punisher Warzone is the exact same thing, but just calling it out even more at the end, where this police officer, someone holds him up, and instead of even trying to instinctually do anything cop-like, it's just like, Frank, can you come kill this guy? Frank, can you just kill a petty thief? Like, it's, the police are just such a joke in this, but I feel like it's 100% intentional.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that was another thing, though. The Punisher had a complication, much like Batman's, or Daredevil's, or any of these other guys. Penchant for taking on guys with guns, without guns. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, they just, I want to take out a bunch of guys with guns, and I don't want to use any guns. Just like that, I think the Punisher, or rather the Punisher, shoots guys and won't shoot cops. And that's obviously, like I said, like you just earlier said about this movie, Punisher like shoots a cop, and it's like the worst thing he can imagine. Like Punisher in the comic books has had nightmares about killing an actual good cop.
No, and I think that's kind of the saving grace of this movie, at least, you know, structurally, is that it does finally pit Frank against the one true villain, which is himself. Like, Punisher's biggest foe in this is not Jigsaw. It's definitely himself, because I feel like he takes out Jigsaw with relative ease and relative glee. There's not really, like, there's never once in this movie where I was like, oh man, Jigsaw, he could end this right now. I was like, no, never. That's never the point. I guess that's the thing with the Punisher, and you know, sometimes Batman as well, is that the only person that can pose a threat to a character that has been deified so much by comic books, and more importantly, comic book fans, that the only person that could take them down is themselves. I kind of feel like that's why anytime there's a new Superman movie, you almost start with like, Superman has to be his own greatest enemy, because who else can be?
Right. And see, and that's getting to the crux of kind of the reason why I don't like this, is that in the real world, again, a guy pushing 60 that has military skills, but he's still he's just an old man. He's just a big tough old man.
Old in this. He's
I know,
like
I know,
40s.
Yeah, I know, but that's they keep making the wars he fights in get more recent. You know what I mean? Like, he was one of the main reasons why the Punisher was really cool to me was the Vietnam thing, especially as they started letting him get older and older.
Right.
I just thought that was part of the mythos. Like, now he's like he's about to be Unforgiven type Punisher. You know what I mean?
And I think that's kind of like the only Punisher comic that I would be 100% into, is if Frank is like this 80-year-old guy. If you did the Logan, if he was 80 years old and just be like, I should have just killed myself when my family died. Like, look at everything I've done.
Well,
like,
was this
worth it?
Yeah, that's what John Wick was supposed to be originally. The original script, called Scorn, I've read it. The John Wick character is like 60, and it's supposed to be like a last ride type of movie, and then turn into a franchise.
I mean, John Wick is very Punisher-y, but even then, it's like, maybe it's because this movie just assumes, which I think incorrectly assumes, that you know Frank's backstory. There's like a weird flashback in this movie that's very brief, doesn't really say anything, and I'm always distracted because one of his kids is in this very gaudy sailor suit, so I can't concentrate on
but again, one of his kids is Donald Duck. Like, what the hell is going on?
I don't, and that's where I'm just like, okay, well, that's maybe why I connected a little bit with the Thomas Jane Punisher, because that movie, rightly or wrongly, at least spends the first act of that movie setting up that he has a family, and you watch them get taken away, so his motivations make sense. But at this one, they just drop you in and they're like, look, he had a family, they got killed, he does this, just don't worry about it, just go. And most of the time that would really bother me, but I think because that's kind of how I feel when I read a Punisher comic, which is like, yeah, he had a family, it was really sad, but don't worry, this is not that. And you're like, oh, okay.
Well, I mean, but again, the best Punisher stories weren't really about that. The best Punisher stories, honestly, because Jim Shooter or somebody was the editor, and every comic is somebody's first comic. They started instituting the little headers that told you more or less the whole story of them up to that point.
Sure.
in a few sentences that they would always put on there. And it was always like one of those things. But like in the comics, he was just like, yeah, this dude is doing some stuff for the cartel. I better go move into this like motel and stay there for 3 days doing recon. It's like, and then the stories of him at a motel for 3 days. You know what I mean? It's just weird stuff.
I mean, that seems reminiscent of like the Punisher Dirty Laundry short with Thomas Jane.
Exactly.
This movie too, you know, a lot of critics said that this was, I think it's been called, one critic called it the best looking bad movie I've ever seen. And I really love, there's a story, and I don't know how true it is. It sounds like it could be true, but there's a story that Lexi Alexander requested that a bunch of Punisher comics be sent to her so she could read the source material. And when they sent it, she kind of mirrored the aesthetics that she saw in the comics, only to find out later that they had reprinted it on very cheap paper with cheap ink and didn't really use all the colors. So the Punisher aesthetic in this movie is what she thought was being super accurate to Punisher comics, but instead was just accurate to the cheapo facsimiles she got of great Punisher comics.
Well, that sounds like pre-Marvel Studios crap to
right,
me.
Yeah. that is definitely an Avi Arad move right there. He's just taking pictures on his iPhone and sending it to her. But I love the way this movie looks. I think it's like the R-rated version of like Dick Tracy with like its very unique color palette and just the way that, you know, I've said so many times, I'm more interested in something that in a comic book movie that looks slightly otherworldly. I know it's like New York, but it's not quite New York. And I love the way this movie looks.
Well, yeah, I do enjoy the fact that it didn't try to be realistic, especially once the Punisher started being like, you know, Superman of violence. I like the fact that they weren't trying to act like that was realistic. However, it was like they gave her the some old cheapo stuff and some of the Garth Ennis stuff from the death throes of Marvel Knights, as Marvel Knights was like kind of going out as the way to do the Punisher, and they were going to reboot him in the Max line. Some of those stories that big he would like punch a polar bear, and the polar bear would get really mad and go bite some mobsters that were chasing him. You know what I mean? Like stuff like that would happen, and then you'd look up and a guy was wrapped up in an anaconda. He has an AK-47 or a shotgun rather, and an anaconda is wrapping him up in a tree, and the Punisher's like, "Yeah, thanks, Snakey." You know, it's like, Jesus. You know what I mean? So like, I think she got some of those comics too, because some of that sort of stuff is not with animals, but you know what I'm saying. Some of that goofiness is happening in this movie.
I mean, I think that's maybe it's also like the juxtaposition of like these intense greens and yellows and blues and reds, all these like very colorful things set within this very like hyper violent and not fantastical, at least plot wise, type of movie. It's the juxtaposition of like the story that's happening with like these Thor Ragnarokian visual palette behind it. You're like, this doesn't quite gel, but I kind of like that it doesn't.
Well, dude, check it out. And I just finally got the words to articulate the aesthetic for the Punisher that I think I envision, and I think a lot of fans envision who feel as though he hasn't been captured yet. Imagine, if you will, a little bit of John Wick with a little couple of things tamped down just a little bit, but some of that, I just got shot twice, but you shot my skull chest thing, and now I can break you off with some Muay Thai and shoot you, and then roll and then grab an M60 and shoot these guys that are coming down the hallway, that sort of thing. Combine that with the shootout in Heat. You know what I'm saying?
Definitely,
that precision. Dig that precision of him reloading in real life. He has to reload, and he has the appropriate amount of ammo. And you can watch him in an adventure go from having a lot of ammo to very little ammo and barely getting out of there. You know what I'm saying? Like beautiful, like tactical movements, like in Heat, and then a little hyperbolic action when he gets into close fighting, like John Wick. That's like the aesthetic. And it's never been produced. And again, those Garth Ennis comics I was telling you about, the ones at the end of the Marvel Knights where he's punching polar bears and jazz, and there's the old mafia lady that's like a head in a jar and all this weird stuff. That was the Punisher, Thomas Jane Punisher too. Him going to an apartment building and living in there, and then a big giant super Russian comes in. It's almost like they have no confidence in the aesthetic that I just pitched to you. They don't have any confidence in that aesthetic, and having the people that he kills be like very powerful people in a realistically rendered world, and he takes them out with those tactics I just said. They have no interest in that. It's always Punisher versus a guy who throws Volkswagens. Punisher versus a weird dude with no face who can't be killed for some reason, and his local brother. You know, it's just, I don't know. It's never like what the good Punisher stories, to my mind, have him actually killing. People who bilk people out of their pensions, monsters, slavers.
Punisher is one of those characters that it's so hard to have him work within a world where there is a Spider-Man, where there is even a Daredevil. I kind of feel like is a more interesting approach to street level things, which is like, I try to fight crime in the courtroom, but then the ones that I just can't get there, I'll get them myself later. But I also think too, like, this movie never was interested in trying to achieve something that John Wick did.
Right.
I think and that's why, look, I have to think that this movie is like a 90-minute, like, really? You guys really like this stuff? Because even the stuff that's like incredibly comic book accurate, or at least true to the spirit of the comic, just feels so ridiculous when you see it in live action. When that priest says something about God and he's like, sometimes I'd like to get my hands on God. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard a human being say. But if I read it in a comic book and I was 14 years old, I'd be like, ooh, yeah. Someday when I'm old enough, I'm getting a tattoo of that, you know?
But again, it's just like how, like, if you just, vanilla tastes great, but if you just take a big swig of vanilla extract, it tastes horrible. You know what I mean?
That's 100%. I totally understand what you're saying. And I think,
Yep.
I think the reason, and maybe, I don't know, I don't have a big enough sample size to do a Pepsi challenge test, but maybe the people who really, really love this movie, like myself, are just not Punisher fans. And maybe that's what appeals to me about it, is that it's just everything that I don't like about the Punisher is magnified to a point of absurdity. I think I've used this recently on a Rebooted episode, but I'm like, it's almost like a Family Guy joke. Like, it just, it comes around so big for so long that I end up being entertained by it, because it is such an over-the-top representation of the things that I think are kind of stupid. And I'm talking specifically a lot of those Punisher comics that are like, you know, the over-the-top 90s violence ones. That's not to say that there aren't stories in there, like you said, that are probably really great. I will be the first to admit I have not jumped into them. I don't really have a desire to. I think the only
that's
comic book...
That's the thing I was going to say. Honestly, bro, I know you're trying to be magnanimous, and I really appreciate it. But there have been people who made impassioned pleas for me to get into Archie comics. It ain't about to happen. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I certainly understand. Sometimes the juice ain't worth the squeeze, and it's not your aesthetic. And I think that's the great thing about the spirit of this show. Nobody's trying to convince anybody that you have to see it this way. It's just like, but it is explaining, okay, this is why I see it this way.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And I think, you know, I've seen a lot of people that love this movie lament that it didn't do well. And by saying it didn't do well is a compliment. This bombed so hard that a lot of people didn't even realize it was out in theaters. I saw it opening weekend because I'm so much of a Marvel apologist that I'll go see anything that they slap their logo onto. And I saw it. It was in December. It was right before Christmas. I saw it on a Friday night, and I was like, this is weird. And then I took my another friend the next day. I was like, dude, you gotta see this Punisher movie. And it's really out there. And I loved it. and a lot of people did. The people that did see it, a lot of people that did see it really loved it. There was kind of this cult classic feeling about it. And a lot of people lamented that there was never a follow-up, but I don't think I would have liked a follow-up to this. I think it's for me personally, it's kind of a one-note joke. And once I'm done with it, I'm like, I don't need to see the joke for me again. I get it. I like it. It's funny. It's over the top. It's ridiculous, but I don't need 4 more of them.
Well, I mean, honestly, bro, I think that just is a lack of vision on your part, because I envision a sequel where the guy who got blown up on the parkour, like he lands in a dumpster, drags himself out. He's like, "Yeah, all right, bro, you're not gonna keep me down," and he gets some kind of like realistic robotic legs, like just like some junkyard forklift repurposed or something, and he becomes the new nemesis for this Super Punisher. Yeah, I'm joking, obviously.
What I do find like unrelentingly fascinating is that there was a preschool style Marvel animated show called the Superhero Squad Show, and it was meant for preschool, kindergarten, 4 or 5-year-olds, and the Punisher is in that show voiced by Ray Stevenson. It is canonically the same Punisher.
Oh my god! Like Punisher babies?
Kind of, yeah. It's definitely it's like they had like a toy series based on it, like Mini Marvels is what they were called, and it's like Marvel bath toys essentially, and they made a show about it, and the Punisher, I think Microchip's in it too, but the Punisher is definitely voiced by Ray Stevenson, which is bonkers to me.
Dude, the proper Punisher bath toy should say something like, "Hey, beat up whoever gave this to you."
I don't know what I would do if I had this on my kid and I just heard Ray Stevenson's Punisher and looked over and like, that, I don't know, guys. I don't know if I want my kid to like super idolize the Punisher. And I think you hit on that earlier, by the way, and I wanted to say there is something very disconcerting about like police officers and the like who kind of sport the Punisher t-shirt. I don't know. I always feel weird when I see someone in a Punisher t-shirt. It's not to say that they're bad people or even that they're like weirdos or anything. I just kind of am like, why'd you choose that one? Like, what makes you want to wear that symbol?
Well, I think I can very easily explain that very succinctly. They
Sure.
want to be as right as the Punisher and have the ability and the will to punish if necessary. And I understand how crazy that sounds, especially in California. You know what I'm saying? But I'm from Missouri, and I get it. I really do. I get it, and it is. But I understand it's a fantasy, and I think that's the kind of where it kind of stops. I think some people don't recognize it as a fantasy. And I think that some people are obsessed with the way the Punisher was used in certain earlier incarnations as Punisher fought whatever white dudes of that era were scared of. Mm-hmm. That's why such an astonishing number of crackheads get shot in the 80s. Punisher used to literally put rocket launchers through the windows of crack houses and stuff. You know what I mean? So I definitely understand that there are people who dig that about him. Mine is very emblematic of a scene in Bourne, actually, Punisher Bourne, where they have him in Vietnam. And long story boring, some guys are about to do some ghastly things to a female Vietnam combatant, and he shoots that Vietnam combatant. To spare her, basically. And the character later goes, that's the Punisher's version of like justice. She was an enemy. She had been shooting at them. But he had done the math on if they took her as a prisoner or what the guys were about to do to her and put her out of her misery, quote unquote. And then, unbeknownst to the rest of the soldiers, he went back and killed the soldier that was going to do that act or was in the process of doing that act to that soldier. Killed him. and just left him. You know what I mean? And it's like, jeez Louise. And that was before he had the skull. That was years and years before he had the skull. And earlier in that story, he gets a commanding officer killed because that guy was leading them was giving them bad intel and getting them killed. So he decided to take justice into his own hands. This is way before the Shield. So last things last, I acknowledge that he's crazy. I acknowledge that it's a fantasy that somebody that crazy, and I'm just going to use crazy because I'm old and I'm not about to go through all these different terms. He is insane. And the fantasy is that a person that's insane would use his insanity to really drill down on who deserves to receive his insanity, if you dig what I'm saying. This guy, it's a fantasy for us to think that somebody could ever be right all the time and who he's going to kill and throw his insanity upon the people who deserve it. That's the fantasy. That's the fantasy. That's the superpower he has. You know what I mean? And I can't explain it better than that. And none of these movies have captured that, but that's a story for another day.
Yeah, and I hear you, and I think if I really did love this character, I bet you this movie would actually probably get really under my skin because I think it's just a total farce. It's like if you were the world's biggest James Bond fan and you went and saw the newest James Bond fan and it was that old 60s Casino Royale that was just a parody of James Bond. I kind of feel, before they got the rights to it back in the 2000s, I feel like that's probably more akin to it.
Right. But I just got to say, it did have some great action gags. A lot of these Punisher movies don't have the greatest action gags. They're kind of their era, whatever era they're made in. They kind of have that patina of that era. This was the first one that had action gags that actually stood out. And I think you were right to compare it to The Raid. Now, obviously, not really. But it was trying to go for some sort of over-the-top level and over-the-top proficiency. And Lexi Alexander is a great fighter herself. So we better relax on this movie,
Hey, I like it.
Literally kick some ass, but she's a smart person. She's a good choreographer. She has a great eye for that stuff, and I think she was just going for the gusto. And a lot of fans like me didn't quite like it, but I think it is. I think it's the one that has a really distinct vision. So I think that's why it's worthy of spending an hour on and just jibber-jabbering over, because it is a statement. Whether you like it or not, it's an actual piece of art. It's a statement.
It's definitely one that, look, if you haven't seen it and this has got you curious, just be prepared. If you have any sort of aversion to gore or a weak stomach, this just skip this one. It ain't for you.
Yep.
But if you're morbidly curious and that kind of stuff doesn't bother you, I think it's a fun kind of meta deconstruction of the Punisher wrapped in a decent enough Punisher story. But look, I don't have an affinity for the character, so your mileage may vary. But thank you so much, Ed, for joining me. I know that you love talking comics, and you're so great at talking comics. We've got some Reboot It's coming up. Anything that you want to tease coming up in season 2 of Reboot It?
Well, I mean, I personally think 2 standouts. I'm not going to hog the mic talking about all of them because people got to tune into the channel to check them out. And as you stated, you got to see it to believe it. Some of the things, the hijinks we get into. But there is a sci-fi classic that almost broke the group up.
Yep.
We're gonna reboot basically a perfect movie, and you're gonna see how hard it is for people with any sort of artistic integrity to try to make a new product out of something that's already perfect. You know what I mean? You're gonna see that on stage. And last things last, we kicked Masters of the Universe ass. That Masters of the Universe episode is great.
I'm really excited for that one. I think that'll drop around the time this comes out, or at least within the window. But yeah, there's one episode coming up that is definitely our Beatles White Album, where more than one of us almost quit in the middle of it. So a lot of drama season 2, but also some of our best work It's all on YouTube at the Reboot It channel. Also, thank you everyone to getting to 1,000 subscribers on the Hot Takes with Billy Biz YouTube channel. I'm in the process of working on how maybe to make the YouTube versions a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more different. So if you subscribed, I appreciate it, and I'm going to reward you for that. Thank you so much for listening. Check out Ed GREER on the Nerd Goat podcast, and as we've said many times, Reboot It, and I will see you guys next week.